in school-age children with autism. What do they look like and how can we help? And I'd like to start by saying, well, we do want you to hold personal questions until the end. If you have other questions that aren't personal, or if you have comments or things like that while the talk is going on, feel free to go ahead and share those. All right, so getting started, I'm very excited to talk to you all about this topic. This is one that's very near and dear to my heart. Before I went back to get my doctorate and I was working as a speech therapist, these were my favorite kids to work with and my favorite thing to work on. So just to give you a little outline of what we're going to talk about today, I'm going to start with some information about social communication and what that looks like in a typical interaction. And then we'll talk about what some of those challenges look like in our kids with autism spectrum disorders. And then we'll finish up today by talking about some strategies that we can use, both in terms of clinical applications and also things that parents and other people who care for these children can do to help them with social communication. So I wanted to start by just giving you guys a definition of what I'm talking about when we talk about social communication, so that we're all starting on the same page. So when I talk about social communication, what I'm thinking about is how we use words and actions to communicate messages with another person when we're interacting with them. And with words, we're thinking about single words, we're thinking about phrases, we're thinking about whole sentences. And for today's talk, I'm primarily going to focus on children who at least have that phrase-level speech and some sentence-level speech, so that we're talking about kids that could potentially have a back-and-forth conversation, even if they're not doing it yet. They have enough language for that. And then if there are people in the audience who might have questions about kids with less language than that, I'm more than happy to answer that at the end of today's talk or privately. And then within social communication, so we've got the words and we've got the actions. And what that basically breaks down into is two different categories of communicative behaviors. And one of these is pragmatic language, which deals with those words. And then the other category is nonverbal communicative behaviors. Speech-language pathologists might sometimes call this paralinguistics, but today we're going to stick with that idea of nonverbal communicative behaviors. And this is basically anything that goes beyond the words. So it is actions, but there are also some other elements to it that go beyond words. So we'll start by talking about pragmatic language, or those words that people use when they're communicating. And there's sort of three areas of pragmatic language that we're going to talk about. The first one is speech acts, which basically just refers to the reasons that we're communicating with another person. Maybe we're making a request for an object, or we're requesting some additional information from another person. Maybe we're making a joke and we're wanting someone to be humorous with us. Or maybe we're predicting something that's going to happen in the future. Those are all reasons why we might communicate with another person. Another area of pragmatic language having to do with the words and the way we use them is discourse management. And this really refers to the rules that we have in a social interaction that make that conversation flow smoothly between one person and another. So this includes being able to initiate new topics, to maintain a topic with another person, to elaborate on those topics, and not only to do it for our own topics, but also to do it for the other person's topics. And it also includes things like being able to take turns and speak reciprocally with another person, so it feels like sort of an even exchange and both people are contributing to that. And using nonverbal communication behaviors in social interactions, and then difficulty developing and maintaining relationships. So what I'd like to do is then take this and map it onto those pragmatic language behaviors that we talked about and the nonverbal communication behaviors you see. And the pragmatic language and nonverbal communication behaviors we're going to talk about are probably going to be pretty familiar with you based on experiences you've had, maybe interacting with some of the children in your lives. But at the same time, we don't necessarily expect all of these behaviors to happen in a single child. So you may say, oh, I really identify with this one or that one. Because each child is going to have a unique mix of this. Because again, if you know one child with autism, you know one child with autism. So let's talk a bit about these different characteristics. So in terms of pragmatic language difficulties, we talked a moment about the three sort of big categories, the speech acts, discourse management, and presupposition. So now we can talk about how those break down in kids with autism. So typically what we see in terms of speech acts is that they either engage in particular ones less of the time, or maybe they don't engage in some of those speech acts at all. So there are certain ones that tend to be harder for kids with autism. And specifically, sharing interests and emotions, any of those reasons why we're communicating that relate to interests and emotions, tend to occur less frequently in our kids with autism. We also see difficulty understanding and using non-literal language, so things like humor, sarcasm, idioms, oftentimes difficulty understanding what those mean, maybe interpreting things the way, based on what the words actually mean, as opposed to the way they're being used in those situations. In terms of discourse management, we see these kids oftentimes having difficulty with that reciprocity, the back and forth balanced feel of a conversation or an interaction. Less frequently initiating or responding in an interaction, and having difficulty with that back and forth flow of the conversation. Having a hard time maintaining a topic or elaborating on a topic, especially if that topic is initiated by the other person as opposed to themselves. Difficulty watching the other person, monitoring them to see, are they understanding what I'm saying? And then being able to provide an appropriate clarification if something breaks down. And difficulty, there's a whole lot of jargon here, efficiently formulating effective messages. And basically what I mean by that is putting the words together in a smooth and connected way that quickly gets the message across to the other person. All right, so I'd like to show an example of what some of those features look like in terms of the pragmatic language. This picture is an illustration of what the two people in the conversation are going to be talking about. So this is, again, we're going to see a kid from an ADOS evaluation, and they're going to be trying to have a conversation based on a picture that they're both looking at. And I can't show you the actual picture because it's part of a standardized test, but basically the picture is an outline of the United States, and some of the relevant pieces are, it's got someone that looks like they're maybe water skiing or something of that nature, and then there's going to be an oil rig that represents Texas in the picture. And I tell you that just so you've got some context for what they're going to be talking about. So this is a 10-year-old with autism. And I'd like to just point out a few of which can manifest in a conversation as I'm having a hard time figuring out what information is appropriate to share. So I'm having difficulty adjusting to each person that I might be interacting with. And what that looks like maybe is providing not enough information for a particular partner, not sharing some relevant background information that they might need to understand the other things that we're saying, or perhaps providing information that's not really relevant to the ongoing conversation, or repeatedly presenting the same information so it becomes redundant, or perhaps even giving more detail than is appropriate. So some of my favorite kids are the ones that want to tell you the precise number of things that something happens, or they give you a list of all of their video games. They want to tell you each and every one, where maybe giving one example would be enough. All right, so that's the rest of pragmatic language. And then we've also got the nonverbal communication difficulties. And what we see with this is difficulty sort of changing that rate, loudness, or intonation to be appropriate to the message that they're communicating. Sometimes we get kids that have a hard time understanding that they're always talking too loudly, or that they're not varying their intonation as much as we would expect. Difficulty, again, modulating their eye contact. So either looking too much or not looking enough. difficulty understanding and using gestures. And so we can see kids sort of all along the continuum with this, where you've got some kids that really aren't using gestures much at all, some who are using gestures like nodding, shaking their head, maybe even pointing, ones that have been specifically taught to them. And then you go all the way up to kids that just maybe aren't using those descriptive gestures as much as we might expect, or having difficulty understanding those things when other people use them. And then with facial expressions, again, there's a continuum with this, from kids who have difficulty reading other people's facial expressions. Maybe they do it fine themselves. Some kids have difficulty making it themselves. Sometimes they'll learn to understand some of those basic emotions, but they have difficulty with the more complicated or nuanced ones, or even just not understanding that someone might be hiding their emotions. And then finally, difficulty managing personal space. And so not getting too close, not being too far, being appropriately oriented rather than maybe walking around the room when they're talking. And so I've got one last video clip. Same kid, 10-year-old with autism. And I'd like to use this to sort of bring together those last features of pragmatic language and nonverbal communication that we were talking about. So in this clip, what you'll see in terms of pragmatic language, and specifically presupposition, is that he's going to initiate a new topic. That's where the video starts. The rules. You're expected to figure it out on your own, over time, through your experiences. And those experiences, which might be showing you a particular rule, sometimes there's long gaps between those situations where you're experiencing that. And so figuring out a rule from that, looking for those commonalities and generating a rule, gosh, that can be hard. And then there's another reason why it's so ridiculously hard to learn this. Because there's only one consistent rule. And that's that the expectations are always never the same. They are always going to change. So you have to adapt for each social context that you're in. The rules for school are different from the rules for home, which are different from the rules for a restaurant or the library or an elevator, and on and on and on. You have to adapt for each particular person that you're interacting with. So my experiences with one person are different from my experiences with another person, and each time I'm going to have to share different information with them. So I'm going to have to adjust based on that. And not only that, but we adapt over time. So what's expected of a 5-year-old is different from what's expected of a 10-year-old, which is different from a 15-year-old, which is different from an adult. So I'm going to use greetings as an example of this. So when you're little, the expectation for greeting another person is that you run up and you start playing with them. Or maybe that you run up and you comment on something that they're doing, or comment on something you want to do that seems related to what they're doing. When you get to be a little bit older and you start school, then maybe you might say, "Hi, how are you?" as a greeting. When you get to be a teenager, "Sup." Or something similar to that, maybe a special handshake, whatever it is that's the current generation's slang for a greeting. And then finally, when you get to an adult and you're in a professional context, it might be, "Hi, my name is Catherine Greenslade. How are you today?" Do we ever do that when we're little? Almost never. Very, very rarely. And yet oftentimes that's how we teach our kids to greet other people. So we need to be thinking, what is it that other kids are doing at that age, and then helping our kids figure out how that's going to change over time. So that's really hard when you think about it that way. That's a whole lot of adjusting and adapting, which we know tends to be something our kids have a hard time with. So what can we do to help? Let's fix this. Let's come up with some ways that we can make this easier on our kids. So one of the ways that we can make this easier is to address that first bullet I had, the fact that no one teaches you the rules. We can help make some of those rules more explicit for kids. There are some ways that we can teach what expectations are for particular social contexts. we want to make sure when we're doing that, that we're always preparing them for the fact that they may have to adjust and adapt. So we always want to leave that room for adaptations. And the approaches that we often take, some of the approaches we'll take, are recommending social skills groups, social thinking concepts, teaching those, using social stories, and comic strip conversations. You guys may look at this list and say, Catherine, I know all of these things. Okay, but what I'd like you to get out of this presentation is maybe some different takes on each of those, a different perspective or different insight into those strategies that we use. So, social skills groups. What do these look like, or perhaps what should they look like based on what we know from research? So typically social skills groups start out with some sort of didactic lesson. I'm going to teach you a rule, and then I'm going to give you opportunities to practice. And that practice can take lots of different forms. It might be that we're going to do video modeling, so a video is going to show you how to do that, and then you're going to practice it. It might be role-playing demonstrations, so it might be that the adults in the room are going to role-play and show you how it works. The most important piece here is the last one, which I've called behavioral rehearsal. Basically, all I mean by that is the kids are going to do it themselves. They need to practice doing it themselves. And then the last important piece of social skills groups is that you want to make sure that anything that's happening in that group is being taken outside of that group. So it needs to plan for generalization, for it to move beyond the group itself. So a recent review of the research in 2010 found that social skills are an established evidence-based practice. This means we can count on that as being a good strategy for helping to make change in this population and with these things. So some common characteristics of the research, the studies that they looked at looking at social skills groups: kids were about 10 years of age. Most of them had moderate to high IQ levels, so they were understanding what was going on. They were able to understand and learn those rules. Most of the groups met at least once a week for at least 12 weeks. And the location where it was delivered was typically a clinic. So those are the characteristics of groups that they looked at for their research to come to the conclusion that it is an effective strategy. Doesn't mean that you can't use it for kids outside of those parameters, but that was sort of what they found to be generally effective. Thinking about some particular types of social skills group, there's a program out of UCLA that's called the PEERS program. And basically what that does is it didactically teaches social etiquette for different scenarios. It starts by illustrating what the rules are and doing that sort of through role play demonstrations and having the kids figure out what the rules are for that situation based on watching. And during the role playing, they actually ask a variety of questions to help kids think socially about the situation. So they ask, what is my partner thinking of me in this interaction? And what was that interaction like for the other person? And is that other person going to want to interact with me again? To help kids start figuring out what is the other person thinking and feeling in those situations. And then they were given opportunities to practice. Parents were given homework to take it home and practice it outside. And based on that, what they found was that kids improved in their social responsiveness, how responsive they were in interactions. Kids improved in their knowledge related to those social skills and the rules. And this is the coolest one. They actually improved in the number of hangouts that they hosted with other kids, which suggests that there was something actually happening outside of the group as well, which is great. Another article I read from 2015 was looking at social skills groups. It was a study that was done in schools. And they taught kids how to make requests and share, how to make comments on their own play, how to make comments on other people's play, how to use niceties like please and thank you and those types of things, and how to use what they called play organizers, like how to set up a game, how to follow rules when you're playing a game, and those things. And what they found was that, so they taught them those things, and then they gave them the opportunity to practice things like playing a game. And they found that it had a positive effect on how much kids improved in making initiations with other kids, and that they saw those improvements in initiation both within the treatment context and outside. So again, those are some really nice findings. I do want to say one more thing about social skills groups before we move on to the other topics that I have. And that's something I like to call the rule of 24. This is something from learning theory, which is a whole area of research that some of my colleagues have gotten particularly interested in. And basically the idea of this is that if you want to teach a kid a new word, they need 24 examples of that word to learn the word. They need it to be in toy representations. They need different photographs or different pictures of that word. They need real objects that represent that word. They need 24 different examples. And you can't do 12 examples repeated twice. It doesn't work. You need 24 different examples for the kid to learn a word. Same thing when you're trying to learn a syntactic structure like is verbing, is jumping, is walking, is running. You need 24 different verbs to figure out what that structure is, and probably different nouns as part of the overall sentence to figure out what that rule is. So if we take a step back and think, okay, you need 24 examples to learn a word, 24 examples to learn syntax. Think about our social skills. You need a lot of examples to figure this out. We can't expect kids to practice it once and learn the rule. They need to learn it a lot. If we're teaching how to join a group, you need to take the kids out of the group and bring them back in over and over and over again so that they have to continually join the group. They have to watch the other people do it. They have to do it themselves, and they have to do it in different situations with different kids. There needs to be repetition and variability in order for them to figure it out, which is a lot of work, yes, but at least we know that that's what kids need, that that's what it takes, so that we can plan for it. All right. Another thing that we can do potentially as part of our social skills group is teach some social thinking concepts. So Michelle Garcia-Winner is a speech-language pathologist out of California. I have her website listed down here. But she just has some really nice ways to think about helping our kids figure out how to think about other people. And one of those is something that she calls the 4 steps of perspective taking, which is basically that when you and I are in a shared space, guess what? I'm going to have a thought about you. You're going to have a thought about me. Everyone in this room right now is having a thought about me, and maybe having thoughts about other people in the room as well, because you're all sharing a space as well. I'm going to think about your intentions. You're going to think about my intentions. What am I wanting to get out of being in this shared space with you? And then I'm going to think about your thoughts about me. Stop. I'm going to think about your thoughts about me. Are you having positive thoughts about me? Are you having negative thoughts about me? Or are you having sort of neutral thoughts about me? And have I had previous experiences with you? If I have, how might those be influencing the thoughts that you're having about me? It's a lot to think about. And then, this is the important piece, I'm going to monitor, and I may change my behavior to keep you thinking about me the way I want you to be thinking about me, which is probably positive or neutral, we hope. We hope it's positive or neutral. And so this really plays into just thinking about and considering other people. And when we're going through the different areas of social communication, it especially plays into that presupposition part of pragmatic language, the fact that I'm going to need to adjust based on what you are thinking and feeling about me. This is kind of complicated, and it's a little hard to break down for our kids. So we can take it and we can break it down for them. And I do that by talking about something I refer to as the behavior chain, which basically says, I'm going to do something. You're going to have a thought or a feeling about what I do, and that's going to inform what your actions are, what you choose to do. And guess what? That's going to influence how I think and feel. So what this means is that it's really all about me. So what I do is going to impact whether I'm going to feel good and comfortable in this situation, or if I'm going to feel sort of weird and uncomfortable in this situation. And I have a choice about my own behavior and about my own I have choices about my own behavior. I can't force you to think or feel a certain way. I can't force you to act a certain way. But I can act in ways that increase the likelihood that you're going to respond positively to me, which is going to make me feel more comfortable. So we find that this is a construct that can really help our kids understand not only how other people are thinking and feeling and what they're doing, but also how that has an impact on them. And to help kids understand this sequence of events, we can use social stories and comic strip conversations, both to explain sort of routine situations, as well as more specific situations that may have happened to them. So social stories is something you guys might be familiar with. It's something that's particularly useful for addressing difficulty kids might have with adjusting their behavior to different social contexts. They're basically simple, personalized stories that teach the expectations for a particular interaction, for social behaviors or social situations. So a lot of people are familiar with how to use social stories to prepare a kid for going to the doctor or the barber or a birthday party, things like that. But they can also be used to teach some of these nuanced social skills. So to teach elements of a social exchange, like taking turns when you're playing a board game, or to use your whole body to listen when you're in class, not just your ears, but your whole body. And so Carol, you know what? I forgot to tell you some stuff. So there has been some research on social stories, which has shown mixed results, but evidence does suggest that social stories can be effective in changing kids' behavior. And particularly for things like playing a board game. It tends to be the most effective in kids who have a normal IQ, so something above 70. But there's also evidence to suggest that as long as they have some basic language comprehension, like about the language comprehension of a 3-year-old, you can probably still use social stories with them. And some of that is, how do you write the social story and how complicated do you make it? Carol Gray was the one who originally came up with social stories, and when she came up with it, she recommended 4 different types of sentences to be used. So these include descriptive sentences, which are true, judgment-free sentences that are fact-based. They basically describe what's going to happen. And the important thing when you're writing descriptives is to leave room for variations. And so you typically use qualifiers rather than absolutes in terms of the way you present these. You say things like usually, sometimes, may, as opposed to always and never, which are much more absolute. So putting the usually and the sometimes in there leaves room for kids to know, I may need to adjust in this situation. perspective sentences, which would describe what others are thinking and feeling, and help get at some of that social thinking. Directive sentences are the ones that tell kids this is the expected behavior. This is what you should do. And then the last kind of sentence she recommends is affirmative sentences, which express some commonly held opinion or view, something that's culturally expected. And so what she recommends is that you use these top two types of sentences, descriptive and perspectives, a lot more than the directive sentences. Basically because we don't want to always be telling kids, this is what you should do. It feels a little too directive, I guess. But what we have found in terms of research is that it may not actually matter. Directive stories can still be very effective, and some of that may depend on the particular kid, whether they respond well to having directive stories. So I wrote a little example for you guys for a kid who maybe is having difficulty raising his hand to take his turn in class, and understanding that other kids need to have a turn as well. So I start with some descriptive sentences. My teacher often asks questions in class. Sometimes I will get to answer. Sometimes other children will have a turn. And so I've italicized there some of those qualifiers for you. When I raise my hand, my teacher knows that I want to answer the question. My teacher likes it when I raise my hand, giving that perspective of what the other person is thinking and feeling. Other children may raise their hands too. Sometimes my teacher may ask other children to answer. Those are both descriptive. But then I'm going to give this affirmative. This is okay. It is important for other children to have a turn. That's that commonly held belief. If I do not raise my hand and wait for my turn, my teacher may feel frustrated. The other children may feel frustrated too. Again, giving that perspective. And here's my one directive sentence in the whole story. I will try and raise my hand and wait for my turn. And then I finish with a perspective. This will make other people happy. So what you'll see here is, I'm going to take this back all the way to the behavior chain. You remember I do, other people feel. What I've done in this story is I've actually only hit the first two of those, what I do and what other people feel. You can take that a step further and say, if I do not raise my hand and wait my turn, my teacher may feel frustrated. She may sound angry, or she may, use a louder, or she may just go through whatever the behavior response is in that classroom. I may get a strike, or something like that, so that you can take it on to see how the child is going to feel and what that's going to be like for them. You can bring it all the way back to what they're going to feel in that situation. I haven't done it here because I wanted it to be a shorter example, but you can bring it all the way around the behavior chain. And then comic strip conversations are very similar to social stories. She actually came up with these first. I find that they can be very useful in the moment, and especially to illustrate specific rather than routine situations. And basically what you do is you have drawings, stick figure drawings, because I can't draw better than that, and you illustrate what are people saying or what might they say in that situation, and you use speech bubbles for that. What are people thinking or feeling, and you use thought bubbles for that. And you can use them to show what did happen in an actual specific situation. You can also use them to show what might have happened. So comic strip conversations can be a great way of getting some of that variation in there for kids, so that they understand, well, what if I had said this? What if I had said this? You can get lots of nuance in there by drawing the same situation different ways, and helping kids understand how do those subtle changes affect what the other person might be thinking, or what they might say in response, how they might respond. So thinking back to that rule of 24, the fact that kids are going to need lots of examples, comic strip conversations can be really useful for helping kids get more experience with those rules and what that looks like. All right. I think my time is just about done. just going to very quickly, this is one other social thinking concept, similar in nature to the 4 steps of perspective taking, but this is going to bring my whole talk together in the 4 steps of communication. So if I'm going to effectively communicate with you, I'm going to need to think about your thoughts and your feelings, as well as my own. I'm going to need to physically approach you. I'm going to need to be in the same space as you, and I'm going to need to appropriately manage my space. So far we're on all of this is nonverbal. I'm going to need to use my eyes to think about your thoughts and feelings. We're still all on nonverbal, and we're at number 3. And finally, I'm going to use my words to connect my thoughts to yours. So what I'd like to point out about this is that if all we teach our kids is the nonverbal, they can do pretty darn well in an interaction. And in fact, I can be in a conversation with another person and almost never use words. And you're still going to think I'm fine as long as I'm doing the first 3 of these. As long as I'm nodding, I'm acknowledging what you're saying, I'm appropriately managing my space, you're going to stay thinking about me in positive ways. This one, if all we teach is this and we don't teach this, our kids are still going to look different. So all of these pieces are important. We have to be thinking not just about the language and the words. We have to be thinking about those nonverbal behaviors. All right. Okay. So that was my talk. I've got some